The pounding on my front door was loud enough to echo through the house, sharp and deliberate, like whoever was outside wanted the entire neighborhood to hear it. A man's voice followed immediately after, confident, practiced, and just aggressive enough to make it sound official. "Police, open the door. We need to speak with you right now." I froze where I was standing, my coffee still warm in my hand, my heart suddenly beating a little faster than it had a moment earlier. Through the side window, I could see dark shapes moving on the porch, boots shifting, shadows crossing the glass. Everything about it was meant to project authority, but something didn't feel right. The words were correct, the tone was right, but the rhythm was off, like someone reciting lines they'd memorized too carefully. As I stood there listening, one thought kept repeating in my head: real police don't need to sound threatening to be taken seriously. I hadn't opened the door yet, and already, the situation was spiraling into something far bigger than an HOA dispute. What I didn't know at that moment was that the next 10 minutes would end a campaign of intimidation that had been building for months, and expose just how far some people are willing to go when they think power belongs to them. 3 months earlier, none of this seemed possible. When my wife and I first pulled into the driveway of our new home, it felt like the end of a long chapter and the beginning of something quieter. I'd spent most of my adult life in structured environments where every decision had layers of approval, documentation, and consequences. When we decided to move, all I wanted was peace, space to breathe, work with my hands, enjoy mornings that didn't start with urgency. The neighborhood looked perfect on paper: clean streets, trimmed lawns, friendly waves from neighbors walking dogs in the early evening. The kind of place that advertised stability without saying a word. The first few weeks confirmed that impression. I settled into a routine that felt almost foreign after years of constant motion: coffee on the back patio, small projects in the garage, conversations with neighbors that stayed light and polite. My wife would leave early for work, dressed sharply and always calm, giving me a quick smile before heading out. She never talked much about her job beyond saying it kept her busy and that discretion was part of it. I respected that. In our house, boundaries were understood without being spoken. It didn't take long before I noticed the homeowners association, though at first it was nothing more than a name at the bottom of welcome emails and newsletters. Reminders about trash pickup days, parking guidelines, seasonal decorations. Standard stuff. I'd lived under HOAs before and learned early that the key was compliance without engagement. Follow the rules, stay invisible, and life stays simple. That illusion cracked the day the first violation notice appeared on my door. It was taped there neatly, perfectly centered, as if presentation mattered more than the message itself. The paper informed me that one of my recent exterior modifications did not align with community standards. No greeting, no explanation beyond a reference to subsection numbers in a document I hadn't memorized. The issue? A small garden bed I'd built in the backyard, invisible from the street and compliant with city code. The fine wasn't enormous, but the language underneath it carried weight. Failure to resolve may result in further enforcement actions. I remember reading it twice, more confused than angry. This wasn't a warning, it wasn't a request, it was a declaration. When I contacted the HOA for clarification, that's when I first heard her voice. The HOA president introduced herself with practiced friendliness, the kind that feels rehearsed. She spoke quickly, confidently, and never quite answered questions directly. Everything was framed as policy. "I don't make the rules," she said, even as she quoted them selectively. "We're just trying to keep property values stable." She mentioned that some residents had already complained. She didn't say who. The conversation ended with her reminding me that enforcement timelines were strict. Over the next few weeks, patterns emerged that were hard to ignore. Neighbors I spoke with casually mentioned their own experiences. Flags cited for being too prominent. Lawns measured down to the inch. Decorations removed within hours of being placed. Yet somehow, other homes seemed untouched despite clear violations. Boats parked in driveways, broken fences, vehicles that hadn't moved in months. The difference wasn't subtle once you saw it. The HOA president was always present, always watching. She drove slowly through the neighborhood in the afternoons, clipboard visible on the passenger seat. When she stopped to talk, it felt less like a conversation and more like an inspection. Eye contact just long enough to unsettle, smiles that disappeared the moment backs were turned. She had a way of making people feel like they were being evaluated rather than spoken to. The second notice arrived faster than I expected. This one referenced non-compliance escalation and included a higher fine. The issue was vague, almost intentionally so. Visual disharmony. When I called to dispute it, the tone changed. The friendliness dropped. She reminded me that continued resistance could trigger inspections. She mentioned, almost casually, that the HOA worked closely with outside enforcement partners to ensure compliance. That phrase stuck with me. I started documenting everything, not out of paranoia but habit, dates, times, exact wording. I reread the HOA bylaws carefully, noting inconsistencies between what was written and how rules were being applied. When I compared notes with neighbors, the same story repeated: selective enforcement, pressure, and fear of retaliation. No one wanted to be the person who pushed back too hard. Everyone had something to lose. My wife noticed the shift in my routine before I said anything. One evening, as I was sorting papers at the kitchen table, she asked what was going on. I explained it calmly, laying out the facts the way I always had. No emotion, just sequence. She listened without interrupting, her expression focused. When I finished, she didn't offer comfort or advice right away. She asked one question instead. Have they mentioned law enforcement directly? I told her about the inspections, the threats, the vague references to authority. She nodded once, slowly. Document everything, she said. And don't let anyone into the house without credentials. It wasn't said dramatically. It wasn't a warning. It was professional advice. That's when the HOA escalated again. An inspection notice appeared without warning, scheduled for a time I wouldn't be home. When I requested rescheduling, the response was curt and dismissive. Failure to cooperate may be interpreted as obstruction. The word choice felt deliberate, as if someone was trying to borrow weight from terminology they didn't fully understand. I installed cameras after that, not hidden, not secretive, but clearly visible. I made sure everything was legal and properly disclosed. The goal wasn't confrontation, it was accountability. Neighbors began stopping by more frequently, speaking in lowered voices, glancing over shoulders. One mentioned someone claiming to be from property compliance had walked through their yard unannounced. Another said they'd been warned that refusing inspections could get authorities involved. Fear has a way of spreading quietly, settling in without announcing itself. The morning it happened, nothing felt different at first. It was quiet, ordinary. I just stepped away from the counter when the knock came. Sharp, controlled, not the kind a neighbor uses. Then the voice. Police. Open the door. Standing there, listening to the confidence in that voice, I realized the HOA hadn't just crossed a line. They'd sprinted past it, and somewhere outside, people were pretending to be something they weren't, betting that fear would do the rest. I didn't open the door, and some were. Down the road, my wife was already on her way home. After that morning, the tone of everything changed. The HOA stopped pretending this was about landscaping or compliance, and started acting like resistance itself was the violation. Letters arrived more frequently, sometimes 2 in the same week, each one more formal than the last. The language shifted from requests to warnings, and then from warnings to consequences. Words like final notice and mandatory enforcement appeared in bold. It was clear they wanted escalation, not resolution. What struck me most was how impersonal it all became. There was no room for discussion anymore, no explanations offered. Every response I received felt copied and pasted, stripped of context and humanity. When I pointed out inconsistencies, rules that were being enforced against me but ignored elsewhere, the answers dodged the question entirely. Each case is evaluated independently, they claimed, even as the same pattern repeated itself across multiple homes. Neighbors began sharing their stories more openly once they realized they weren't alone. Conversations that used to end with polite nods now stretched longer, voices lowered, frustration evident. One family mentioned they'd been cited 3 times in a month for things that had never been an issue before. Another admitted they'd paid fines they didn't agree with simply to avoid more trouble. Fear was doing exactly what it was designed to do: keep people quiet. I kept documenting every notice, every email, every voicemail. I organized everything by date, printed copies, saved backups. Years of working in environments where details mattered had taught me one thing clearly: the truth only holds weight if you can prove it. I wasn't angry. I was methodical. One evening, while reviewing the HOA bylaws again, I noticed something that didn't sit right. Several enforcement actions referenced third-party compliance services, yet nowhere in the governing documents did it authorize outside entities to conduct inspections without homeowner consent. That alone wasn't damning, but it was concerning. When I searched the HOA's financial disclosures, the entries for these services were vague. Large payments, generic descriptions, no clear vendor details. It felt intentionally opaque. The next inspection came without notice. I was in the garage when I noticed someone walking along the side of the house, clipboard in hand. He didn't knock, didn't announce himself, just started taking photos. When I stepped outside and asked who he was, he introduced himself as a compliance officer contracted by the HOA. He spoke confidently, but when I asked for credentials, he hesitated. He pointed to the clipboard, as if that alone explained everything. I told him calmly that he needed permission to be on my property and asked him to leave. His tone shifted immediately. The confidence turned sharp, defensive. He warned me that refusal would be noted and could trigger further action. When I reminded him that unauthorized entry wasn't permitted, he backed away slowly, eyes darting toward the cameras. The cameras changed everything. After that encounter, the HOA's communication became colder and more aggressive. They referenced documented resistance. They hinted at escalation to authorities. The implication was clear: comply or suffer consequences. It wasn't subtle anymore. It was coercion dressed up as procedure. My wife reviewed everything with me that night, quietly flipping through documents, pausing occasionally to reread a line or check a date. When she finished, she looked up and said something that stuck with me. They're acting like people who believe no one will challenge them. She didn't say more, but she didn't need to. The next week, a neighbor knocked on my door after sunset. He looked nervous, glancing behind him before speaking. He told me someone claiming to be from city code enforcement had come by his house earlier that day. The man wore a reflective vest, carried official-looking paperwork, and spoke with authority, but couldn't provide a badge number when asked. When my neighbor tried to verify the visit, the city office told him no one had been dispatched. That's when I realized this wasn't just harassment anymore. It was impersonation. Once you notice it, patterns become impossible to ignore. Another neighbor described a similar visit. Then another. Each encounter followed the same script: authoritative tone, vague violations, pressure to comply immediately. No follow-up paperwork, no official confirmation, just fear. I added those accounts to my files, carefully noting names, dates, and descriptions. Still, I didn't confront the HOA directly. I didn't accuse anyone. I let the pattern speak for itself. The pressure mounted quickly after that. Notices referenced ongoing non-compliance across multiple properties. The HOA president sent out a community-wide email warning of increased enforcement activity and urged residents to cooperate fully with any officials who visited their homes. The wording made my stomach drop. It was an open invitation for abuse. That night, my wife and I talked longer than usual. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't speculate. She explained calmly that impersonating officials wasn't just unethical, it was illegal and extremely serious. I asked her what we should do. She gave the same answer she'd given before. Keep documenting. Don't engage emotionally. Let them make the next move. They didn't make us wait long. The next incident happened on a weekday afternoon. I was home alone when I noticed an unfamiliar vehicle parked across the street. It sat there longer than necessary. Engine running, windows tinted. Eventually, a man stepped out and walked toward the house. He wore dark clothing, boots, and a badge clipped to his belt. The badge caught the light just enough to look convincing from a distance. He knocked once, firmly. When I opened the inner door but kept the outer one closed, he announced himself as local enforcement. No department name, no identification beyond the badge. He never let me examine closely. He claimed there had been complaints about my property and demanded entry to verify conditions. I asked for a warrant. His jaw tightened. He told me I was obstructing an official investigation. The words were heavy, but the delivery was sloppy, like someone repeating phrases they'd heard on television. When I asked for his supervisor's name, he stepped back, muttered something into his phone, and left without another word. The entire exchange was captured on camera. That was the moment everything crystallized. This wasn't about compliance. It wasn't even about intimidation anymore. It was about control, about convincing people that resistance was dangerous, that authority was unquestionable, and that the safest option was submission. The HOA president sent another message the next morning. This one was different. It was longer, more emotional, warning about hostile behavior toward enforcement personnel and potential legal ramifications. She claimed the HOA was acting in the community's best interest, and that failure to cooperate could result in immediate corrective action. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so unsettling. Neighbors started reaching out directly, asking what I was doing, how I was handling it. Some were scared. Some were angry. All of them were tired. I told them the same thing every time. Document everything. Don't let anyone in without proper identification. And be afraid to ask questions. The HOA's response to that collective awareness was swift. A formal notice announced that enhanced enforcement measures would begin immediately. The language was vague enough to mean anything and threatening enough to mean everything. It mentioned partnerships with authorized agencies and warned that failure to comply could lead to serious consequences. My wife read it once and shook her head. They're panicking, she said, and panicking people make mistakes. The following days were quiet in the way that feels artificial, like the calm before something breaks. No notices, no emails, no drive-bys. The silence itself was unsettling. Then, early one afternoon, my phone buzzed with an alert from the front camera. Movement detected. 3 figures stood on the porch. Dark uniforms, upright posture, confidence radiating from the way they positioned themselves. One adjusted something on his chest that looked like a badge. Another glanced deliberately at the camera, as if daring it to matter. And that's when I knew the next step had already been decided. Whatever they were about to do, they believed it would work. They were wrong. The alert tone from the security system was sharp and unmistakable, cutting through the quiet of the house. I looked at the monitor and felt that subtle shift in my chest, the one that happens when something ordinary turns serious in an instant. 3 men stood on my front porch, positioned deliberately, spaced just far enough apart to look trained. Dark uniforms, utility belts, boots planted wide. One of them leaned forward and knocked, not casually but with authority, like the house itself was expected to comply. A second later, the voice came, loud, confident, rehearsed. "Police, open the door." I didn't move right away. I watched. One of the men glanced at the camera, then away, as if acknowledging it, without wanting to engage. Another adjusted what looked like a badge clipped high on his chest. From a distance, it might have convinced someone. Up close, even through a screen, something felt wrong. The uniforms were close, but not quite right. Too generic. No department name, no unit markings, just enough detail to intimidate without enough to identify. They knocked again, harder this time. "Sir, we know you're inside. Open the door immediately." I took a breath and reached for my phone, starting a recording even though the cameras already were. Years of discipline kicked in automatically. Slow movements, clear thinking, no panic. I spoke through the door without opening it. "What department are you with?" There was a pause, just a fraction of a second too long. "Local law enforcement," the man replied. That answer settled it. Real officers never say that. I asked again calmly, "What's the reason for your visit?" "HOA compliance inspection," he said, voice tightening. "We have authority to enter." Authority. That word again, used like a weapon. "I'll need to see a warrant," I replied. The silence that followed was heavy. I could hear shuffling on the porch, boots scraping slightly against concrete. One of them muttered something under his breath. Another cleared his throat. "Failure to cooperate may result in obstruction charges," the leader said, louder now, as if volume could replace legitimacy. I almost smiled. Obstruction doesn't work that way, and anyone who knows that wouldn't threaten it so casually. "I'm not refusing," I said. "I'm asking for identification and a warrant. You can hold them up to the camera." No one moved. Instead, the knocking returned. Sharper, more aggressive, meant to escalate. It was intimidation, pure and simple. They wanted fear to do the work for them. Through the side window, I saw a dark SUV parked at the curb. No M. Arkings, tinted windows, engine running. Everything about the setup screamed theater. A performance designed to overwhelm someone who didn't know better. I stayed where I was. Minutes stretched. The man on the porch raised his voice again, repeating the same lines with slight variations. Every sentence was framed as a command. Every threat was vague. It was obvious now that they were stalling, hoping I'd crack, hoping I'd open the door just to make it stop. I didn't. Instead, I sent a single text message. 3 words, "They're here." The reply came almost instantly. On my way. Outside, the men were starting to lose their composure. One paced back and forth, glancing down the street. Another leaned closer to the door, lowering his voice as if that would make it more convincing. "You don't want to make this harder than it needs to be," he said. "We can resolve this peacefully." Peaceful. Coming from someone pounding on a door with fake authority. I told them again, clearly and evenly, that I would not open the door without proper documentation. I reminded them that they were being recorded. That seemed to irritate them more than anything else. The leader stepped back, spoke quietly to the others. Their body language changed. Shoulders tense, movements sharper. This was the moment where confidence starts to give way to uncertainty. And then I heard it. The sound of tires on gravel. A familiar engine. Controlled, steady, unmistakable. One of the men noticed it too. He turned just as a federal vehicle pulled into the driveway, clean and unhurried, lights still off. The door opened and my wife stepped out. She didn't rush, she didn't shout. She adjusted her jacket calmly and walked forward with purpose, her posture straight, her presence immediate. Years of training showed in every movement. She stopped a few feet from them and spoke in a tone that didn't need to be loud to be heard. "Gentlemen," she said, "can I see some identification?" The effect was instant. The men stiffened, caught off guard by her confidence. The leader tried to recover quickly. "This is an active enforcement matter, ma'am. Please step back." She didn't. "Which department are you with?" she asked again, holding eye contact this time. He hesitated, just for a moment. That was all it took. "We're authorized by the Homeowners Association," he said. "We're assisting local authorities." "That's not an answer," she replied. She reached into her jacket slowly, deliberately. I watched through the window as the balance of the situation shifted in real time. The men leaned forward slightly, uncertain now. Whatever script they'd been given didn't account for this. She held up her badge. U.S. Marshal. The air seemed to leave the porch all at once. The leader's face drained of color. One of the others took an involuntary step backward. Confidence collapsed into confusion, then into something closer to fear. They knew what that badge meant. Even if they didn't understand the law fully, they understood hierarchy. "Now," she said calmly, "I'm going to ask again. Who are you, and why are you impersonating law enforcement officers on a private residence?" No one answered. One of them glanced toward the SUV, then back at her, clearly calculating. The authority they'd been relying on had evaporated. There was nowhere left to hide. "We're just doing what we were hired to do," one of them muttered. "Hired by whom?" she asked. Another pause. Another mistake. She turned slightly and looked toward me. "Call it in." I stepped outside then, phone still recording, standing just behind her. The men's bravado was gone completely now. Shoulders slumped, voices quiet. The transformation was almost surreal. Within minutes, real patrol vehicles arrived. Ked. Identifiable, professional. The contrast was stark. The 3 men were separated, questioned, and quickly disarmed of their fake authority. Badges collected, claims unraveled. Neighbors began to gather at the edges of their yards, phones raised, whispers spreading. For months, fear had kept them silent. Now, clarity brought them out into the open. One question kept coming up as officers reviewed footage and statements. "Who sent you?" The answer came quietly, reluctantly, but it came. And in that moment, I knew the story was far from over. The arrival of real law enforcement changed the atmosphere instantly. The street that had felt tense and uncertain moments earlier settled into something calmer, more controlled. Radios crackled softly. Questions were asked in clear, professional tones. The 3 men who had arrived with so much confidence now stood apart from one another, hands visible, eyes avoiding contact. Whatever script they'd been given had completely fallen apart. An officer approached me first, asking for a brief explanation. I kept it simple and factual. What they'd said, what they demanded, how long they'd been there. I pointed out the cameras, the recordings, the previous incidents. He nodded, taking notes, then moved on to speak with my wife. The moment he saw her credentials, the posture of the entire response shifted again, this time toward precision. This wasn't a neighborhood dispute anymore. It was something much more serious. As officers began questioning the three men individually, inconsistencies surfaced almost immediately. Different company names, different explanations of who authorized them to be there. One claimed they were simply doing property compliance work. Another said they were contracted for security presence. None of them could name a real department. None could produce legitimate warrants. The badges, when examined, up close, were clearly not official. Close enough to fool someone at a glance, but not enough to withstand scrutiny. Neighbors started approaching cautiously, drawn out by the flashing lights and the sight of uniformed officers doing actual police work. Phones were out, recording from sidewalks and driveways. A few people I recognized exchanged looks of disbelief, the kind that comes when something you've feared privately suddenly becomes visible to everyone. One by one, officers began asking the same question: have you had any contact like this before? The answers came quickly. Yes, last week. Yes, a man in a vest. Yes, someone claiming to be an inspector. Each story lined up with the next. Different houses, same approach. Authority implied, never proven. Pressure applied, never documented. It didn't take long for the focus to shift. A senior officer stepped aside with my wife, speaking quietly. She listened, nodded, then glanced back toward the three men. I didn't need to hear the conversation to understand what was happening. The situation had crossed from civil intimidation into criminal territory, and everyone present knew it. That's when the white BMW pulled up. It parked just far enough away to avoid the cluster of patrol cars, the timing too precise to be coincidence. The driver stepped out with purpose, head held high, shoulders squared. Even from a distance, the posture was familiar. The HOA president had arrived. She walked toward the group as if she belonged there, irritation written across her face. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice sharp. These men were authorized to be here. Every camera in the area turned toward her. An officer intercepted her calmly, asking her to step back. She bristled, insisting she was in charge of the homeowners association and that this was an internal matter. The words came fast now. Defensive, rehearsed. She claimed there had been complaints. Claimed she was protecting the community. Claimed authority she no longer had. My wife stepped forward and addressed her directly. "Ma'am, do you know these individuals are being investigated for impersonating law enforcement?" The question landed heavily. For a moment, the HOA president hesitated. Just long enough. "I hired them for compliance enforcement," she said. "They're contractors." That was enough. The conversation shifted immediately. Officers began asking follow-up questions, this time with a different intensity. Who hired them? Who paid them? Under what authority? Her answers grew less certain with every sentence. She attempted to reframe it as a misunderstanding, then as overreach, then finally as harassment against her. None of it worked. As more neighbors stepped forward, the picture became impossible to deny. Statements overlapped, timelines matched, the pattern was clear. This wasn't an isolated incident or a miscommunication. It was a coordinated campaign of intimidation built on borrowed authority and fear. The three men were placed in the back of a patrol vehicle while officers continued their investigation. The HOA president stood off to the side, arms crossed, jaw tight, watching as control slipped further from her grasp. The confidence she'd carried for months was gone, replaced by something brittle and frantic. Within the hour, investigators began requesting documents, HOA communications, financial records, contracts. The president protested, insisting everything was legal and approved. But when asked to produce immediate proof, she couldn't. The rest unfolded faster than I expected. News vans arrived after someone tipped them off. Reporters kept their distance, filming from the street as officers escorted individuals, reviewed evidence, and spoke with residents. The story was no longer confined to our block. It was public now, and there was no pulling it back. Over the next several days, the consequences multiplied. The HOA board called an emergency meeting. Attendance was higher than it had ever been. Neighbors who had stayed silent for months now spoke openly, sharing experiences that mirrored my own. Fines issued without explanation. Threats of enforcement without authority, selective targeting that made no sense until you saw it as a pattern. The HOA president resigned before the meeting ended. Investigations continued quietly after that. Audits were requested. Outside agencies got involved. The so-called contractors were charged appropriately. The paper trail that followed them led back to decisions made at the top of the HOA, decisions that had never been properly disclosed or approved. Violations issued during her tenure were reviewed and dismissed. Fees were refunded. Policies were rewritten. Transparency became the rule instead of the exception. But the biggest change wasn't procedural. It was emotional. The neighborhood felt different almost immediately. People lingered outside longer. Conversations stretched into the evening. There was a shared understanding now, a collective exhale after months of pressure. Fear had lost its grip. One afternoon, a neighbor I barely knew stopped me while I was working in the yard. He thanked me, not for confronting anyone, but for documenting, for staying calm, for not escalating emotionally when it would have been easy to do so. "You made it safe for the rest of us to speak up," he said. That stayed with me. Weeks later, life had settled into something resembling normal again. The cameras were still there, quietly doing their job, but they mostly recorded ordinary things now. Kids riding bikes, delivery trucks, neighbors waving as they passed. The same things that had drawn us to the neighborhood in the first place. Looking back, the most unsettling part wasn't how far the HOA went. It was how easily it could have worked. How CLO's fear came to winning simply because authority wasn't questioned. The lesson wasn't about confrontation or revenge. It was about patience, documentation, and understanding the difference between power that's claimed and power that's legitimate. Bullies rely on people staying quiet. Accountability relies on people paying attention. If there's one thing this experience reinforced, it's this: real authority doesn't need to shout, threaten, or disguise itself. And when false authority is challenged calmly and consistently, it collapses under its own weight. The knock on the door that morning was meant to end the conversation. Instead, it ended the intimidation.